Craig Bryce lay quietly on the bed in his hotel room, trying to sleep. He had just attempted to make his late-night phone call to Amanda, his wife of over 23 years. He was halfway through another tiring business trip. The older he got, the harder it was for him to separate when one trip ended and another began, not to mention their usefulness. It was all just a blur. They began to take their toll on him. He spent more than half his life on the road, devoting much of his time to almost 20 of his 23 years of marriage. Craig was definitely looking forward to retirement. He hoped that in 6 or 7 years, he and Mandy would be able to enjoy the lifestyle they had worked so hard to achieve their entire lives together. Craig wasn't bothered by the work itself. He loved his job and was proud of the accomplishments of his staff. Abaoth liked to tell people that as VP of Operations, he didn't actually do any real work. He simply traveled, talked to people who were working, and tried to remove obstacles on their path to success. Of course, this was all to make money for the company. The fact that he was very well paid for his efforts always surprised him to some extent. He didn't consider himself smarter or more persistent than most, but he learned the secret a long time ago. Far more people feared success than failure, for many reasons, but overall, it came down to fear. His job was simply to make people less afraid. Craig usually fell asleep immediately after an evening telephone conversation with his wife. He found it soothing to listen to Mandy's voice. This made it easy to fall asleep. But that hasn't been the case lately. He mulled the smallest thoughts and suspicions over and over in his head. Lying in bed and looking at the ceiling, these thoughts raced through his head again. Craig was not a naturally scary person. But over the past few months, he has become more concerned that Mandy is cheating on him. On the surface, Craig told himself it was impossible. But too many nagging fears led him to believe that he would have to do something to confirm or disprove his fears. He definitely didn't have a smoking gun, but it was little things that accumulated, and then one big event last week. When their daughter Tori left for college last fall, Mandy became very quiet and depressed. Craig thought it was just normal, empty nest syndrome that parents often experience when their children leave home. After all, although he would never admit it, he too was depressed when Tori left home. When he talked to Mandy about it, she agreed that she too was very sad that their daughter was gone from their daily lives. It left a big hole in her world. Mandy's depression worsened. It even got to the point where her boss at Kingston Limited had to sit down with her to discuss her deteriorating performance. It didn't help much, and then about 4 months ago, almost as if she turned on a light switch, his wife has returned. She became cheerful, playful, and her performance was restored. Even their sex life became lively again. Mandy, who had always been quite conservative in bed, suddenly became very active and wanted to experiment. Craig was a man, so he was naturally delighted with her changes. He wasn't going to complain about the return of their honeymoon. He teased her about it good-naturedly. She told him she just wanted to make sure she was taking care of the most important person in her life. They started spending weekends together 2 or 3 times a month, and both enjoyed it immensely. She also began to dress better. It wasn't provocative at all, just more professional. As an office manager for a large national company, appearance was important. So again, the way she dressed in itself meant little. It was another work-related change that really increased his anxiety levels. Mandy always took pride in the work she did and enjoyed discussing all aspects of her work with Craig, but then she suddenly stopped. She hasn't mentioned work in the last few months, other than to say she has to stay late at work because of a new project her company has acquired. Missed phone calls and other discrepancies followed. For example, a month ago, Craig returned home early from a business trip and decided to stop by her office to see if they could go to lunch. Her assistant apologized to him, saying that he had just missed her since she had left with her colleagues a few minutes ago. He had a strange, unpleasant feeling the entire time he was in the building. Somehow, Mandy's assistant, Jennifer, became more formal in her approach to him and had difficulty maintaining eye contact. He had known Jennifer for years, and she always called him Craig, but that day it was Mr. Bryce. Craig almost said something but decided against it. As he walked out of Mandy's office building, he could have sworn that several people were looking at him. Craig checked his zipper to make sure it wasn't open, Utah. Perhaps he was simply becoming paranoid in his old age. That night at home, he asked her about her day, and all she said was that she had so much work to do that she didn't leave her desk. Interesting. He also noticed that she began changing clothes and showering at unusual times. He realized that she only did this on long working days. Perhaps she always did this, but he didn't notice before. It wouldn't really be that weird to want to take a shower as soon as you get home after a 12-hour day at work, would it? Then last week, everything came to a head for him. They both got home late from work and were too tired to cook, so they decided to order food to take home. Amanda's phone was closer to him, so he picked it up to call and order delivery, only to find that the phone was locked. After 20 years, does she need a password? He asked her about it, and she laughed nervously. She gave him the code, and he made the call. At the dinner table, she voluntarily explained that the guys at work told her she had to password protect her phone because of all the work data on it. Craig agreed it was a good idea and thought nothing more of it at the time. A few nights later, when she was sleeping, he was sure she was fast asleep because she was snoring. Mandy always denied this, saying that ladies don't snore, they just breathe deeper. So, while she was breathing deeply, he stood up, took her phone, and entered her password. She changed him. She changed her password within 2 days of giving it to him. Seriously. Craig was very proud that in over 20 years of deployments, he had never cheated on his wife. He never even came close to cheating. This was no accident. Early in their marriage, Amanda was very jealous. When Craig traveled, he knew how worried she was. He tried to call her every evening while he was away to try to calm those fears. Over the years, she became more relaxed about his trips. But Craig still always had a personal policy of never getting into risky situations. Sometimes it was dinner and/or drinks with work groups or clients. But Craig always tried to leave first. If the group went to the club, he refused. When he was alone, his habit when returning to the hotel after work was to stop for one quick drink at the usually empty hotel bar and then head to his room, where he would order room service and read a book or catch up on work. Then he made his call home. Then there was self-satisfaction. Craig even told Mandy about how he did this years ago when she was having a hard time with his absence. He tried to ease her anxiety. It became their inside joke. Mandy reminded him not to indulge himself, as she called it, the night before he returned home. She wanted him to be able to carry out his duties upon arrival. He didn't care if anyone thought he was antisocial or a nerd. He wasn't going to let himself get into a dangerous situation that might cause anxiety or increase her tendency towards jealousy. On the one hand, Craig was ashamed to even have these doubts. But again that night, his call to his home phone went to the answering machine. When he called her cell phone, it went to voicemail. He sighed and disconnected without leaving a message. If this follows a familiar pattern that has become increasingly common, he will receive one of several excuses. "Oh dear, sorry, I fell asleep early. When I woke up, it was too late to call, given the time difference." Or, "I was in the basement doing laundry." Then there was his favorite. "I was late at work and lost track of time. I'm really sorry." At least he hasn't yet received the universal excuse of, "Oh, I went out for drinks with the gang from work." He felt terrible that he had lost trust in her. He knew that a marriage without trust was in serious danger. So, as he lay with his hands behind his head and staring at the ceiling, wondering what to do, noises from the room directly above him caught his attention. Oh great, he thought, the hotel isn't even half full, and he'll have someone above him to bother him all night. Such were the dangers of business travel, and he took a deep breath, closed his eyes, and tried unsuccessfully to block out the noise and fall asleep. Lying in Thea's, they lay down. He heard a woman in the room where the sounds were coming from begin to moan. The moaning turned into cries of, "Oh my God," and "Yes, yes, yes." He could hear the bed creaking and the headboard hitting the wall. He began to satisfy himself with these sounds, thinking that this was better than an ordinary film for adults which he watched on business trips. He always thought about his wife during this activity, no matter how perverted his fantasies were. He always told Mandy all his fantasies, and that they included her. She thought it was so cute. He always kept quiet about the fact that his fantasies included them both in bed with a couple of her friends. After all, he was a man and everyone has secrets, right? The lovemaking upstairs continued for hours. Damn, this was not an act of love. This was pure bestial sex. There could be no couple in that room. He laughed to himself. He dozed, waking up from time to time throughout the night. Finally, around 4 in the morning, he heard someone leave. The closing door of the hotel in the dead silence of the night had a unique sound that everyone in this place heard. However, he was able to sleep for a few hours. His alarm clock woke him up as planned. Craig wasn't rested at all. As he shaved in the bathroom, he could hear someone moving around in the same room upstairs, going through their morning routine. He made a mental note to never stay at that hotel again. The walls here were too thin. Out of curiosity, he tried to go out to meet someone in the corridor or in the elevator. He heard the door upstairs slam shut. He knew it was a woman because he could clearly hear the sound of her shoes knocking on the floor in time with his steps as she approached the elevator from above. When Craig approached the elevator, he paused for a moment before pressing the call button. He heard the elevator pass him on the way up. He stopped on the floor above. He quickly pressed the call button and waited. Luckily, the elevator immediately began to descend and stopped on his floor. When he entered, there was only one person there. He got lucky. "Good morning," he offered. The woman standing in front of him was about his age. There was nothing particularly remarkable about her. To be honest, she looked like every other businesswoman he often encountered. She was quite tall. In heels, she almost reached his 6 feet. She was big. He valued it at about 150 well-proportioned pounds. Craig liked curvy women. She was neatly dressed in a traditional business suit. She wore a dark jacket with a white blouse that showed a reasonable amount of cleavage for a work environment. The woman wore a simple string of pearls around her neck. She wore a pencil skirt that went just above her knees and tights. Craig wondered if they were pantyhose or waist stockings. He preferred stockings with a belt. His wife often indulged his fantasies in this area. The woman had her dark hair pulled back tightly into a bun. She wore dark-framed glasses that made her brown eyes appear larger. Craig always thought women with glasses were very sexy. He constantly encouraged Mandy to get her eyes checked in the hope that one day she would need glasses. So far to no avail. He definitely had a fetish for Sarah Palin. Craig couldn't help himself. As the elevator began its descent into the lobby, just a few floors below, he smiled friendly when he spoke. "Good morning. You look tired." She responded with a smile of her own. "I had a rough night." "Yes, I heard. I'm sorry about that." "Don't apologize. You saved me $9 on my hotel bill, and it was better than any movie they offered." "I'll try to be quieter tonight," she said jokingly. "Please don't do this, Glad and me. I could save another $9. And they laughed together as the elevator reached the lobby. They got out, wished each other a good day, and went about their business. Craig had a busy day, so all his thoughts about his meeting with this intriguing lady disappeared. Luckily, he didn't have time to worry about Mandy either. Overall, Craig had a very productive day. He was tired but happy with his work when he returned to the hotel around 6 p.m. He decided to stop at the lobby bar to drink his usual scotch before heading to his room. He headed straight to the bar, although he preferred to sit in a booth in the back. He was pretty sure there wouldn't be a bartender waiting tables on a quiet weekday evening. The place was almost empty. The only sound was the wheels of the all-purpose rolling suitcase or spinner, owned by nearly 100% of the traveling businessmen, rolling across the lobby tiles as their owners came and went seemingly endlessly. It was almost a game among the crowd of business travelers to see how big a bag they could manage and then stuff it into the overhead bin for the flight home. Craig was going against the flow. He always checked his luggage. Yes, it cost him a few minutes, but it saved a lot of hassle and kept his blood pressure under control. Plus, he always enjoyed watching the show on board as the next lemming tried to stuff his bag into a cramped space while the flight attendant rolled her eyes, knowing that the bag would end up in the cargo hold. It was always the last one to unload. Hey, when you're a traveler or work for those who do, you find your joys everywhere. The barmaid was busy with nothing but watching the local news, so it took a few minutes to get her attention. When he finally got her attention, it still took her a while to tear herself away from whatever tragedy the hosts were chattering about. He ordered his usual Dewar's white label on the rocks and sat on the bar stool to await his drink. He figured it would take for a while. "Hey, pervert, why don't you join me?" The woman's voice was almost familiar. Craig wasn't used to being called a pervert, but he assumed it was directed at him because there were no other people in the room. Well, except for the bartender, and she looked more like someone's grandmother than a degenerate. He turned around and looked around the dimly lit room. Sarah Palin sat in a corner booth in the background. Not the real one, of course, but that woman from the elevator, who in this light, in his opinion, really resembled Governor Palin. Having nothing better to do, he decided to join her. He wanted to tell the barmaid about this, but she had her back to him, so he shrugged and headed towards the booth. The first thing he noticed about her, besides the fact that she was dressed the same as in the morning, was the drink in her hand. It was a glass with ice and a couple of fingers of amber liquid. This wasn't a glass of wine or some exotic cocktail with a few plastic chopsticks sticking out of it. He thought it was probably bourbon without ice. Very unusual. "Yeah, it's Maker's 46. Do you have a name, or should I just keep calling you pervert?" Craig laughed and extended his hand for a handshake. "Craig Bryce, is this where we exchange business cards?" He smiled as he sat down in her direction. Corinne Glenwood," she responded, shaking his hand tightly. "And no, I won't give you my business card because you'll probably just use it to start following me." They both laughed politely. There was an immediate feeling of connection between them. No, not in a sexual sense, but rather a shared experience, hard-earned by spending countless nights away from home. It was the type of connection that could develop into a good friendship over time. They engaged in casual conversation, asking each other about their jobs and travel schedules for a few minutes while they waited for Craig's drink to arrive. After an agonizing 10 minutes, he finally arrived. Despite his disappointment, he still left a generous tip for the barmaid. Her indifference, not to mention how small she poured it for him, was not unusual in his experience. Hell, she worked, he worked, and both wanted to be somewhere else, almost anywhere else. Craig had always loved studying people, and as he talked he watched how Corinne handled her drink. She is one of those people who always smelled alcohol before trying it. This helped to enjoy the full flavor of the drink. She didn't hit him with one gulp, trying to drown out the pain. She wanted to enjoy the chosen drink. He guessed that most of the time she drank no more than 2 drinks at a time. Craig knew that in some circles he was committing the cardinal sin of filling his scotch glass with ice. But to hell with it. He enjoyed stirring it endlessly with a plastic straw and then chewing on one end of the stick. The advantage of ice in his drink was that he could still enjoy the taste of the alcohol after the amber liquid was gone. He continued to crunch the ice until it disappeared completely. If he got desperate, he could chew the stick to suck the last of it out. While Craig was observing her drinking habits, he noticed that Corinne was wearing a wedding ring. This upset him. A distressed expression appeared on his face. It reminded him of all his insecurities about Amanda. Corinne noticed a change in his mood. "Everything is fine?" "Yeah, it's just." He had inspiration. Do you mind if I ask you some very personal questions? There was a sparkle in Corin's eyes. Yeah, sure, good friends can ask personal questions. I mean, after spending last night all over you, I guess that makes us pretty good amigos, doesn't it? They both laughed so loudly that the bartender even turned away from the TV to look in their direction for a moment. When he calmed down, he had a moment of indecision. He wasn't sure he wouldn't end the evening right then and there if he continued. Don't die wondering, Craig. So he decided to continue. Do you love your husband? And why? Why do you do this? Corin's mind worked quickly. She prided herself on her ability to read people. She was the chief compliance inspector implementation of EOC standards at a large defense company. She is used to people trying to deceive her. When she first started, they tried to intimidate her, but they soon realized that she was not to be trifled with. When 95% of a multi-billion-dollar company's business comes from the federal government, compliance with EOC standards is no small matter. This may influence the choice of contract. No, people stayed away from her if they wanted to keep their jobs. Corinne studied Craig's face. She was sure he wasn't trying to get her into bed. He also did not make moral accusations. He asked the question with some confusion, but mostly with sadness, she thought. She knew what really interested him. Wow, let's start with the easy questions, huh? She was a little surprised by his straightforwardness, but when she later found out he was doing similar work, it made sense. He didn't work for the EOC, but worked in technical compliance, but the concept was the same. She was a thoughtful person, so she took time to formulate her answer. Yes, Craig, I love my husband. Do I think we are soul mates, destined to be united as the only people in the whole world made for each other? No, we are a good team, and we raise good kids together. She got a little distracted. I hear a lot about people who feel an instant attraction and think they have found their soulmate, when in fact it's sex pheromones. She laughed. Love comes later. At this point, she lightly tapped her phone and brought up the photo file. She quickly flipped to the family album and spoke in detail about her husband and 3 teenage children. It was clear that she cared deeply for her entire family, including her husband. This only added to Craig's confusion. She put the phone away. As for why I'm doing this, it's a little more complicated. If I promise to tell you everything, may I ask why you want to know? She thought she already knew the answer, but she wanted him to say it himself. She needed him to be involved in the conversation. I think my wife, Amanda, or Mandy, is actually cheating on me. The problem is that, well, I know that she loves me, at least she definitely did before. So why? There it was said. I listened to you talk about your family, and in 15 minutes I can tell that you love them all. Why risk it all? Wow, Corinne was caught off guard, not so much by the words, but by the depth of the conversation she knew still had to be had. Corinne was heading home in the morning, so she planned to get a good night's sleep. Looks like that won't happen. Craig was clearly a man in pain. She didn't know if her words would help him or hurt him further, but he deserved the truth from her. She already felt a kinship with him. I see what I do when I'm away as something I need. It sounds cliché, but I feel like it makes me a better wife and mother when I get home. I'm not sure how to explain it, but I really enjoy being a mother and a wife. However, when I'm at home, sometimes I feel like that's all I am. I also need to feel like my own person, an independent woman in control of my thoughts and body. She paused to think about how else to explain it. Don't get me wrong, I know it's wrong and it might hurt, but on a cost-benefit basis, it's worth the risk for the greater good. Do you understand that? Yeah, I think I see where you're coming from. But is the potential price you might pay really worth the risk? So, if your husband finds out, do you think he'll divorce you? That's a really good question. I would hope not because I don't want to lose my family, but knowing him as I know him, yes, I think he would divorce me. Her eyes became wet, and she had to look away to keep the tears from flowing. But I'm very careful about what I do. For example, I would never sleep with you. Don't get me wrong. I know you're not harassing me. How do you decide? Well, Craig, first of all, you're married. I don't sleep with married men, period. I might as well risk my marriage, but not someone else's. I can't say that I've never slept with a married man, because some people hide it very well. But I am quite good at finding out a man's marital status. Pale skin at the sight of the ring is an obvious sign. But if you talk to a man long enough about general topics, sooner or later, if he is married, he will say, "My." When he says that, it's all over for me. Secondly, I see that you are a virgin. Virgin. Yes, you've never cheated. I try to choose men who are single and have had the experience. Virgins will say if they are married, they may feel a moral obligation to confess to their wife. That's what you would do if you cheated. Craig nodded, acknowledging the truth in her words. If they are unmarried but new to the business, they will brag to their friends. This is something I cannot allow. Also, I never sleep with men under 35 or so. Young people not only love to brag, but they also love to record there, so I only do this in my hotel room. One more thing, I don't do casual relationships. I travel to 4 different places, and I have a couple of male friends in each that I can rely on when needed. And I never, ever cheat on my husband when I'm at home. At home, I don't even flirt with men, under any circumstances. And lastly, I didn't sleep with anyone last night before coming home. I wouldn't do that to my husband. I know it sounds funny, but I respect him too much. Wow, that explains a lot. Corinne, let me ask you something else. If your husband had confronted you when you got home from a trip, not with photos and a private investigator's report, but just with his suspicions, you would have been lying. To him? Corinne took a slow breath and collected her thoughts. It was a good thing the lounge was quiet because she barely whispered her answer. No, I wouldn't lie to him. For me, that would be worse than cheating. Am I crazy? No, Corinne, you're not crazy, but you're complicated. She laughed like a little girl, and then she became thoughtful. I never thought about it like that, but I guess it really is difficult. Do you ever plan to tell him? Say, when you're old and wizened and spending your last days in a nursing home? No, Craig, I won't lie, but I will take this with me to the grave. Isn't this worse? I can't imagine a deeper pain or greater disrespect a wife could show. His question remained unanswered. My situation may be different from yours, Craig. Like I said, I never considered Tom to be my soulmate. He's just someone I really like, and I chose him to start a family with. However, I would definitely be disappointed if I couldn't live the rest of my life with him. Are you sure he feels the same way about you? Have you ever asked him why he married you? This was another unanswered question. They both fell silent for a while, so they just enjoyed their drinks. Craig broke the silence by crushing the ice cube in his mouth. Corinne looked at him with mock disgust. Ice cubes, right? She just shook her head sadly. Now it was Craig's turn to be lost in thought for a moment. You're right, I'm a virgin. I could never change Mandy. Guess it's just not in my genes. He continued to talk about his life with Mandy and Tori. He emphasized how much he enjoys being a father. You know, Corinne, I spent all of 19 years raising my daughter, trying to be a good example for her. It's one thing to talk, but I feel the best lesson is to do. He could see that it affected her. Sorry, Corinne, I didn't mean to sound judgmental. It's weird, but somehow I'd be worse off disappointing Tori than Mandy. Does that make sense to you? Yes, that makes sense. Craig, I'm thinking about that aspect. I wonder what I would say if, in 10 years or so, my married daughter came to me and said she was thinking about cheating. What would I advise her if she asked me for advice? Oh yeah, I think about that a lot. Corinne Beganala cried quietly. Maybe you should stop. It's not too late. You may be right, but I have no regrets. Like most difficult things in life, it's not black and white. At least in my case, it's not. She seemed melancholic. I don't think I'm explaining it to you very well. Sorry, I'm being so pushy. Corinne, I'm just trying to figure it out. And you're doing a great job of explaining it. You're really helping me a lot. Why do you think Mandy would cheat on me? She pulled herself together. First of all, you don't know for sure if she's cheating on you, but if she's doing it, I suspect it's for some of the same reasons I do it. She just doesn't have the luxury of covering it up with travel. Based on what you told me about her and your marriage, my guess is that if she's cheating, it's with just one person. You can't. She immediately raised her hand to stop him, anticipating what he would say. That's not a knock on you. As Mandy's husband, you can't give her what she needs in this case. My guess is that she's with a man who allows her to just be herself. Like I said, when she's with him, as in my case, she is completely a woman with no responsibility to anyone else. But when she is with you, no matter what happens, she is a mother or a wife first. I know it's another cliché, Craig, but this really isn't about you. I'm not sure I agree. If it's not about me, why am I suffering so much? I don't see how it wouldn't hurt, Craig. But the more important question is, if she does cheat, can you live with it? Would Tom do it? She just shook her head in denial and continued. Well, Craig, then I guess sooner or later you'll have to discuss this with her. I hope I never have to be in your situation. It's too late. You don't have to believe it, but I miss my family. I need to go to bed to catch an early flight. I can't wait to get home. Sometimes this life we lead gets so boring. Anyway, I really enjoyed our communication. Thought-provoking. She smiled her mischievous smile again. I promise I'll be quiet tonight. I'll be alone. She pouted sad lips. Don't turn on the full volume of the movie today, okay? I don't want you to disturb my sleep. Goodbye, Craig. She looked at him with sympathy and sincere hope that she would never have to face his dilemma. As she left, Craig thought blankly that Corinne looked as good leaving as she had when she came. He still didn't know what he would do about Mandy, but now he had a better idea of what might be going on in her head. At least he had a couple more days away from home, so he had time to think about it. On his flight home, Craig unusually chose a window seat. He spent most of the 3-hour flight looking at the terrain as he passed by. He was so lost in thought that he didn't even notice that they hadn't experienced any turbulence while crossing the Rocky Mountains. When he saw Las Vegas below, it dawned on him. Wow, this is a first. When he first started traveling for work, he noticed that seasoned travelers, heading east or west, would put away their laptops and fasten their seat belts as they approached the Rockies. It only took him a couple of trips to understand why. On the way home from the airport, Craig was having an internal debate with himself. He wasn't sure if he should hire a detective to find out if Mandy was cheating on him. Part of him wanted to just ignore it all. But in the end, he decided to just confront her with his suspicions. He wouldn't have little time, money, or energy to spend on conducting an investigation. He couldn't live with uncertainty, and he definitely wasn't capable of just burying his head in the sand. So he decided it was time to talk to her. That's the most offensive thing you've ever said to me. I'm not going to answer that question with dignity. How could you even ask me that? She jumped up from the table and headed to the kitchen, holding her half-eaten dinner in her hands. You didn't say no, did you? He said this calmly and evenly, despite the anger that was boiling inside him. He no longer had any doubts. So, it's come to this. You're just going to lie to my face. What have I ever done to deserve this from you? He suddenly felt old and very tired. She stopped where she was, but didn't turn to him. It seemed like it took forever, but it probably wasn't quite a minute before she spoke quietly. You didn't do anything, Craig. Nothing at all. She still couldn't look at him. Finally, she turned and returned to her seat. She sat silently, looking at Craig. He knew she was deciding whether to lie, tell the truth, or give him a sanitized version. She chose to lie. Craig, honey, you shocked me. I would never have thought that you would even ask me such a thing. Of course, I'm not cheating. Mandy, Please don't lie to me anymore. Can't we just be adults about this? Are you really going to make me hire a private investigator and set up cameras and all the other investigative crap? I can't believe you're going to make me do this." She was silent for a long time. What she said next surprised him. "Listen, Craig, darling, can't we just leave it? We're so good together now." She asked this in obvious desperation. He shook his head slowly and deliberately. He was silent, staring at her. He waited. "Okay, Craig. Yes, I've been dating someone for about 4 months now." She covered her face with her hands, but did not cry. In fact, she seemed surprisingly calm. Craig's mind was in disarray. Although he knew that it was true, what she finally admitted shocked him to the core. It was as if he had been hit in the stomach. All the air was knocked out of him. He really didn't know what to say next. He was rarely as confused as he was now. "Why did you lie to me, Mandy?" It wasn't the first thing he planned to say, but under the circumstances, it was all he could think of. "Of course I lied to you, Craig. Telling the truth would have hurt. And, of course, I never meant to hurt you. Would you have acted differently if the situation had been the other way around?" "No, Mandy, I wouldn't lie. I couldn't. I've always considered you my soul mate. It seems like maybe you've always been more important to me than I am to you. This realization saddens me greatly. Will you at least let me explain why? Honestly, if you feel the need to unload, go ahead. But I recently talked to a friend who explained everything to me. I really don't want to know who it was, when it started, or any other details. The fact that you did it is everything that matters to me." This made her think. I think I have to so we can move on." Craig simply shook his head and raised his hand, waving for her to continue. She then spent 20 minutes explaining herself. Craig was bored and only half listening. After all, he had heard it all before. It wasn't that he didn't believe she was sincere, it just didn't matter to him. He realized after a while that she had finished speaking and was looking at him silently. They were both surprised at how calm they were. It was so civilized that it seemed a little surreal. Mandy broke the silence. "What do you think, dear?" What? Sorry, what did you say?" "You know about us going to counseling to help us heal our marriage. Were you listening to me?" "Of course, that's normal, I guess. But I have one more question. If I never found out about this, would you ever tell me? I mean, when we're 80 and in the house elderly, remembering our life's ups and downs and preparing for the inevitable approach of the last days of our lives, would you tell me a story, can you?" He looked at her so carefully. She had to evaluate the matter honestly. She didn't lie anymore. Craig was right. He didn't deserve this. "No, Craig, I wouldn't tell. It was something I needed for myself, and it would eventually go away. I fully intended to take it to my grave. It would hurt you too much. And there's no way that was connected to you, so why would you say it?" Their divorce was finalized 6 months later. Craig sat in yet another nameless, nondescript hotel bar with his signature drink in front of him. It's been almost a year since his divorce was finalized. He recalled that period. It was the most difficult time in his life. Mandy did not contest the divorce. What was there to argue about? They lived in a no-fault divorce state. Tori was an adult. They sold their house and divided everything in half. The biggest blow was finances. Instead of retiring at 55, Craig will have to work until he is 65 to live comfortably. He assumed Mandy was in the same boat. He never really talked about his feelings to anyone about that period of his life. The only pleasant memory of that time was his daughter, Tori. If there was one thing, it was that he and she grew closer after he divorced her mother. He remembered the first call he received from Tori after he moved in and filed for divorce from Mandy. "Hey, Dad. Mom told me everything. I'm so sorry about all of this." "It's not your fault, honey. Sometimes these things just happen." Craig was preparing for a flurry of attempts to mediate his parents' problems, or worse, choosing sides. But this did not happen at all. Dad, listen to me. I'm sorry to be so blunt, but yeah, it's about to start. I'm sorry to be so short with you, but you are my parents. I love you both and will always be grateful for the wonderful childhood you gave me. I couldn't ask for a better mom and dad. Her voice trembled, but she continued. Your relationship is between you two. I will not interfere in any way. We are all adults, and I'm sure we will find a way to deal with this in the future. She thought for a moment. I'm planning to spend time with both of you. I expect you to behave accordingly during future family events, of which I am sure there will be many. But the first time one of you speaks ill of the other in my presence or tries to make me gossip about the other, it will be a long time before you see me again. Do we understand each other? Absolutely understandable, Tori. I love you more than life itself. I'm proud of you. Strange. That's exactly the same thing my mom told me an hour ago when I was talking to her about the same thing. She laughed. Even though this conversation took place more than 18 months ago, thinking back on it still brought tears to Craig's eyes. It was the right of a proud parent. A voice interrupted his nostalgic thoughts. Hey, pervert, what a coincidence. How are you doing? Craig looked up, and there she was, dressed much the same as when he first saw her, with a drink in her hand, smiling at him. He just stared at her. She looked even better than the first time he met her. Earth is calling Craig. Hey, it's getting awkward standing here like this. He woke up and jumped to his feet. I'm sorry, Corin. Please sit down. I'm just lost in my thoughts. I do this a lot these days. After Corinne settled into her seat, she looked at Craig's ring finger, then back to his face. So she really cheated on you. She said this without joy, because she did not take pleasure in his misfortune. He was a good guy in a bad situation. Do you want to talk about it? Craig didn't know why, but he wanted to. He had never talked to anyone about his divorce before, but somehow he felt like now was the time. He spoke nonstop for more than 20 minutes. Corinne did not interrupt, but listened intently. So you still love her, don't you? What the hell is that question? I just spent the last few minutes explaining why I divorced her. True, but you never called her a bitch or a lying cheater. You never said anything bad about her. It was always Mandy or my wife. You still love her. It was a statement, not a question. Craig hadn't really thought about that aspect. Yeah, I guess I still have feelings for her. I mean, you can't just stop caring. He snapped his fingers as he said it. At that moment, he noticed something. Corinne didn't have a wedding ring, and there was no pale skin where it should have been. He caught you, and he pointed to her finger. Now it was Corinne's turn to be sad. No, I gave myself away. Really? I'm surprised. I mean, after everything we talked about. She smiled bitterly. Yeah, well, a very good friend made me feel guilty for. Damn, I'm so sorry, Corin. I didn't mean to. She waved her hand at him dismissively. It's not your fault. All you did was open my eyes to the truth about what I did. After our meeting, I could no longer behave normally around Tom when I returned from the trip. I guess that guilt started choking me. He eventually noticed that something was wrong, so he asked me about it. She shook her head sadly. I couldn't lie, so I just told him. It was actually a huge relief for me, but he reacted the way I thought he would. He didn't deserve what I did. He's a good guy. In a way, you remind me of him. It was obviously emotional for her, but she continued. You know, I told you that he wasn't my soulmate when we got married. Well, I finally realized that he was for me, so I told him that. Soulmates don't lie to each other. So you got divorced then? No, not yet. We are legally separated and are going through counseling. I don't think it will help, though. He seemed so sad and hopeless during the sessions. He has moved out of the house. He is such a good father to our children. I know he is very. It hurts to be separated from your children. Well, I hope everything works out for you. He couldn't help but smile. So you still love him? Corrine snorted. Craig couldn't tell if she was laughing or crying. She just lowered her head, looking at her drink. They talked for more than 3 hours, mostly about everything under the sun, because their emotions were too intense to discuss anything serious. At the end of the evening, they adjusted their work schedules so they could meet more often. Craig looked at his watch. It was already past midnight. Sorry, Corin. I didn't mean to take up your entire evening. Surely you had other plans? No, not really. I don't do that anymore. Craig. She said this somewhat shyly. I was kidding myself back then. I'll do whatever it takes to get my family back. So that includes keeping my legs together. So you're a loser, cowboy. Her smile returned. Craig had to laugh, and he shook his head with regret. Me too. Just kidding. The opportunity just never came along. And now you're rejecting me. Damn, I'm really unlucky, aren't I? They laughed and went in different directions. Both were already looking forward to their next meeting so they could spend more time together. And they did just that. Over the next few years, they met 2 to 3 times a year. As expected, Corrine's marriage ended in divorce. She was sad about this, but she was preparing for the worst. The damage she did to Tom was too much for him to overcome. She didn't blame him at all. Her friendship with Craig and their long conversations helped her cope. At one point, they even considered sleeping together. However, they felt that in their lives, it would not be difficult to find a friend with benefits. In fact, they both had such relationships at different times. They laughed that it was much harder to find a friend without benefits, so why ruin a good thing? The truth is that they were both like rudderless ships floating on an ocean of loneliness. They found solace in their camaraderie. On the other hand, Craig and Mandy remained polite, but only saw each other at family events that they couldn't avoid. When Mandy noticed him at these meetings, she always gave him a sad smile and looked hopeful. But Craig simply nodded at her neutrally and moved on, trying to move away from her. Many years later, when Craig was attending one of these events, he had an unpleasant feeling. He couldn't say exactly why, but he felt like everyone was sneaking glances in his direction, especially his daughter Tori. Then he found out why. Hi, Craig. Mandy. It was a little unsettling to see his ex-wife, especially since he was in the corner. The only way out would be through Mandy. He also felt like a dozen or so eyes were looking at him. He simply sighed and resigned himself to his fate. He had skillfully avoided her all these years, but now he was trapped. He was just 6 months away from retirement and had plans to move to the Valley of the Sun to spend his remaining days golfing and drinking. He didn't need these complications. I finally understand why you left me. Just, without how are you doing or how nice the weather is, she hit him right between the eyes. Yes, he was really curious to know if she really understood it. It's not because I cheated, is it? He shook his head in denial. That's because I never intended to tell you, did I? He nodded slowly. How did you come up with this? She laughed regretfully. Several years of therapy. Someone was finally able to make me understand how terrible those words were. I couldn't believe I was capable of hurting someone I loved so deeply. We could have gotten over my cheating if I hadn't said this. I don't know if we could have saved our relationship in the long run, Mandy. But before you said those words, I was still trying to find a way to make us work together. The sad thing about it, Craig, is that even after I realized what I did, I was angry at you for ruining us just by my words. If you could get over cheating, why not my words? How could those stupid words be worse than what I did? I didn't realize it until too late. I guess I kept thinking that if only you hadn't left, I could have convinced you of my love. Well, Mandy, the truth is that I never doubted that you loved me. Corrine helped me understand this. In fact, I couldn't handle you breaking my trust and the torment I felt because of it. If you gave me a chance, I know I could regain your trust. No, Mandy, I don't think you could. Tom interrupted sharply. You don't understand how deep my trust in you was. Men aren't necessarily the simple creatures that pop culture portrays them to be. We have emotions, deep emotions. We live with the constant fear that we won't be good enough. Or what? This is how we let down our families. I shared this level of intimacy with you. It was something I would never allow another person to see, for fear of being exposed as a fraud. What are you talking about, Craig? Are you the strongest man I know? It's basically acting. A man's inability to let others see his weaknesses is a genetic tactic of self-preservation. It probably goes back to prehistoric times. If a man showed weakness or fear, it could cost him his life. It was millions of years ago. Mandy, Craig interrupted, since I was 10 years old, you are the only person I have ever cried in front of. Do you remember when my father died? Of course, but what? What do you remember most about that time? She immediately knew the answer. How I held you in my arms while you grieved the loss of your father. I have never felt closer to you in my life. No one else saw it. Mandy, I wouldn't let them. I was vulnerable, and I was counting on you to help me through it. I cried in your arms like a baby. I left myself completely exposed in front of you. That's how deep my trust in you was. If we lived to be 100 years old, I would never be able to be so vulnerable in your presence again. I would be too afraid of you exposing my vulnerability. One more thing. Do you remember all the silly games and other sexual intimacy we shared in bed and other places? Yes, and I am terrified of them, but not enough. Well, for me, the scariest part of cheating was the fear that you would tell your lover about what we did and you would laugh about it together. Even if you didn't laugh at me, did you? Did you share anything with him, either of these? Her shoulders slumped and she couldn't look him in the eye. You were the only person in the world with whom I shared all my hopes, fears, dreams, and failures. You saw me in the best and worst light. Do you understand now? She finally understood it, and she began to grieve for what she had so thoughtlessly lost. But she was a fighter, and after a long pause to find an acceptable outcome, she pulled herself together. Craig, honey, look at me, please. He looked. I'm so sorry that I didn't understand, but you're wrong about one thing. When you confronted me back then, you said that I was more important to you than you were to me. That's simply not true. I was too selfish for that. Understand, but in reality I need you much more. I still need you, much more. I can't live without you in my life. That's why I'm here, begging for your forgiveness and trying to find a way so that we can move forward. Together. Look, let's say you're right, and that we can never be who we were before. Can't we still be good together? Does it have to be all or nothing? Trust me when I say I'll take everything from you, that I can. I know that you still care about me. Of course I care, but... Wait, please listen. I'm not naive enough to think that we can get back together and magically go back to the way things were. It's my fault. It's all my fault. I killed what was beautiful and special with my selfishness. Her tears flowed freely, but she felt hopeful. We could start slowly, being friends, you know? For starters, I would be happy if you were back in my life, at least on a minimal level. I don't want to be that person you've been politely nodding to at family events for the last 17 years. Ignoring each other is becoming hard work. For me, just having dinner together would be a huge step forward. Do you know what I mean? I understand what you're saying, but... It was difficult for Craig to continue. He hid his emotions for many years. He had finally gotten used to who he had become, and now this. She, however, had no intention of letting him go and hide. She moved closer to him, carefully placing her hand on his tightly folded arms. Craig, maybe I'm being selfish again, but were you really happy without me in your life? Look at us. She waved her hand around the room. We're here celebrating the birth of our third grandchild, and we're acting like complete strangers. How is that right? She started to cry but held on tight and continued strong. Just take me out to lunch. Or if you want, Take me somewhere where no one can see or hear us and yell at me. But please don't ignore me anymore. I'm retiring soon too and don't want to spend it alone. Do you want to? It seems like such a waste of precious time. Craig's thoughts returned to the conversation he had recently had with Corinne. Mandy didn't know, but a few months ago he spent a few days with Corinne and her husband Tom. So, he was waiting for Corinne at the hotel bar, and she walked in holding hands with Tom. Both wore wedding rings. When Craig recovered from the shock, he listened to what they had to say. It came down to the fact that neither of them found a replacement for the other. They came to the conclusion that it was because there was no better partner that they belonged together. Then they both laughed and said that besides, they didn't want to die alone. Tom did most of the talking in the first part of the meeting. Corinne reached out to me. We sat down and actually talked for the first time in years. I think when you get older, a lot of things don't mean as much as they used to. I spent the best times of my life with Corinne. And yes, the worst too. Why are they the worst? Because she meant so much to me. In the end, the good memories outweighed the bad ones. But either way, she was a constant in my life. He was emotional, continuing my story. Eventually, she asked me what I thought would be the worst thing that could happen if we tried again. That really stopped me in my tracks. What was the worst that could happen? I came to the conclusion that it was nothing that hadn't happened before, and I survived it. Craig had always been a thoughtful person, so Tom's words were not alien to him. He realized that when you reach 40, you begin to realize that you will die someday. But this is still an abstract concept. When you're 60, death becomes a fact. It becomes a constant element in your decisions and thoughts. What do I want to take care of with the time I have left? You also begin to wonder how you can spend more time doing things that are important or enjoyable, instead of doing things that are unnecessary. You begin to cleanse your world of garbage. Craig was no different from any other 65-year-old. He had thought about all these things, but had not yet found the answers. Corinne intervened at this point. We knew we couldn't go back and be who we were before, so we decided we needed a new paradigm. Tom quickly raised his eyebrows in surprise. Corinne laughed. No, it's nothing weird, Craig. We just decided we'd be together as partners. Our kids are grown and gone, so it's no longer an issue. We sold our house and most of our other things that took over our lives because we allowed it. I continue to work because I love what I do. Tom retired because he hated what he did. Now when I have to travel, we travel together. I think that's a long way to go to say. There's nothing different between Tom and I now. Remember years ago when I told you that I needed time to just be myself? Not a mother, a wife, or a housewife. Craig nodded. That's what I am now that I'm with Tom. I'm just me, nothing else, and that's all I need. Tom apologized at this point, grumbling about forgetting something. It seemed like a contrived exit designed to leave Craig and Corinne alone. Craig, besides Tom, you are the best friend I have. I care so much about you, and it hurts me to see you unhappy. I'm not unhappy. Yes, you are. Your pain is visible every time I see you. Don't get me wrong. I don't think you feel sorry for yourself every day. I don't think you feel anything. You're numb to never again suffer, and it breaks my heart to see you like this. Tom gave me a second chance when I didn't really deserve it. What I did to Tom was much worse than what Mandy did to you. Can't you give her a second chance? If not for her sake, then for yours. No, Corinne, what Mandy did was worse, but I see your point. I'm just not sure I have the courage to do what you're asking. You're asking me for 2 hours of bravery in a dark alley at night. I just do not know. Craig returned to the present. Mandy looked at him quietly with pleading in her eyes, seeming to hold onto his hand more tightly than before. Craig had built walls around his heart for years. He couldn't tear them down overnight. He wanted to, but it might have been too late. Sometimes, however, you just need to step onto an invisible bridge across the chasm. This is the only way to know if this bridge is real or not. I even like your idea of going somewhere quiet so I can yell at you. Mandy, if you want to try it." He smiled without reservation for the first time in a long time. A very happy 60-year-old Corinne Glenwood sat quietly at the table in her kitchen alcove. She was drinking a cup of coffee while going through yesterday's emails. Morning sunlight streamed through the open shutters. It was early spring and still quite cool outside, but she still opened the windows to let in fresh air. She would have to close them in a few minutes because over the years she had found that her many aches and pains were quickly aggravated by the cold. However, the breath of spring air always gave her a feeling of hope and renewal. It was part of the endless cycle of life. This brought her comfort in her old age, and it always lifted her spirits. So she repeated this process every day, even when it was raining. At this time, her husband Tom entered the kitchen, wearing an old, shabby robe with coffee stains that she bought him 100 years ago. Every time she threatened to buy him a new one, he just said, "Why? There's nothing wrong with that. He's still working." This familiar detail smiled at her. She wanted to watch Tom struggle with the coffee maker because that was funny too. But instead, she went back to her email. She noticed a letter from Craig Bryce, so she let him through. The letter included a photo of him and his wife Amanda with the Eiffel Tower in the background. She remembered Craig telling her that they were going to be in Paris on the first day of spring. Corinne was happy for her friend. He finally pulled his head out of, well, you understand. Ever since he got divorced, he had always looked like a tired man, so she was glad to see them both so excited and happy. "Look, Tom, this is a photo of Craig and Mandy with the Eiffel Tower in the background." Tom walked over, spilling some coffee along the way. Corinne just shook her head. He leaned closer. "It's great. Craig is a really lucky guy." Corinne patted Tom on the shoulder and looked lovingly into his pale blue eyes. "Yes, he is. Almost as happy as I am." Subscribe to our channel so that your second chaff doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think about listening to the next one.